Hello, and welcome to the Philosophy and Theology Uncorked podcast. I have the tremendous honor of speaking with two of the most important thinkers in my own life, primarily Dr. Charles Taliaferro, who is a former professor at St. Olaf College and a current member of the Cambridge Institute for the Study of Platonism at Cambridge University. He's written over 35 books, written or co-edited over 35 books. And he is just one of the most flexible, fast, incredible intellectuals I've ever had the honor of encountering. And I'm really excited about the conversation with him. My co-host is Alan Salmon, who is a good friend of mine from Harvard Graduate School, where we met, and who is also a budding theologian and has an incredible richness of insight, which is embodied and exhibited not only in the way that he articulates himself, but the way that he lives. So I'm very excited about being joined by these two people for an incredible discussion. And with that noted, I would like to finally say that this specific episode, which is our first episode ever, is dedicated to Chris Collins, who was a member of our Facebook group, but unfortunately passed away recently. And he had been encouraging me to do a podcast for a long time. And I want this podcast to be in his honor. So with that being noted, if we could, Dr. Charles Taliaferro, why, before we begin to talk about your incredible book, why did you choose to become a philosopher?
Well, that's a great question. I'll just make one observation. One is that it's a pleasure to be here. Second, Christophe is someone that tout le monde should pay attention to. He's one of the most creative thinkers I've ever encountered, and brainstorming about things philosophical or cultural even have been one of the most exciting I've had in my 40 years in higher education as an instructor or philosopher. Professor, I mean. I didn't exactly choose to become a professor of philosophy. I think that most of us who are born and thinking are in a way proto-philosophical. That is, I think of philosophy as the love of wisdom and also just simply having a worldview, having values. If you're at all reflective, you have a philosophy of some kind. Then, in other definitions of philosophy can be then characterized as disciplined reflection on worldviews. And then back to its roots, philosophia, the love of wisdom. This is where philosophy is a way of life. And have felt drawn to, one, trying to be clear about my own conception of reality, what it is there, and values really from the get-go. But especially when I was a teenager, I grew up with two brothers, half-brothers, who later told me they hated me. Why? Because they were children of my parents before they were my parents. So they were half-brothers. And so I was the firstborn. And I asked one of them, he said, I think I've stopped hating you, one of the brothers said. And I said, why did you, and they were both named Jims, made it kind of easy. Does Jim still hate me as much? Why did you hate me? And I said, because you were born. So I grew up, with these two older brothers, about 5 or 6 years older than me, very sarcastic world, and where my own creativity or thinking was definitely not rewarded or enhanced. What happened was I fell into philosophy by reading Will Durant's The Story of Philosophy. This was a very famous book in the 50s and 60s. He basically retired on just that book alone. And I discovered a world in which major thinkers, it's a pretty naive, very simple story, but I loved it. The debates between Plato and Aristotle and so on up through Nietzsche and so on. And these were this was a community in which people argue and reason with each other and they respect each other. It was very much the opposite of the world that I was in. So I came to philosophy as kind of like a shelter or an asylum or basically a kind of forum. You know, the Greek word for truth is aletheia, which means clearing. Heidegger makes a great deal of this, but I discovered in philosophy a kind of clearing. And that's the way I tried to teach philosophy. It was trying to create a clearing in which it was safe to engage in substantial dialogue. And, you know, I majored in philosophy and literature. Then I got a master's in philosophy. Then I thought, but I was also, as a young adult, I became a Christian, and I wanted to learn Greek so I could read the New Testament. I also didn't want to be a naive Christian. I wanted to think critically about it. What really can I reasonably believe? And so I decided to go to Harvard Divinity School, where these two gentlemen went, and got Koine Greek down, took about 4 New Testament classes. But I still loved mostly philosophy or philosophical theology, I would say, is like theological themes, to use your term, uncorked, and mixed up. And so then I went to Brown, and I kind of thought, well, you know, I also love working with students. And I taught at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, taught at community college, Middlesex, you know, for one summer. I loved it. I didn't at first. I started with this community college, and I had 30 nurses, and it began horribly. I thought abortion would be a great topic. And they were just, it was a riot. One of them said, "You're a Nazi." "No, you're a Nazi." And it just was a nightmare. But by the second, well, actually, even the first day, what happened was I actually broke the chair I was sitting in. I just collapsed. And everybody, it kind of broke the tension. Everybody thought it was kind of funny. And so I decided I loved it. And so that's how I became a philosophy professor. Gradually, and I just followed my passion.
Wow. And this actually leads kind of perfectly into the next question I wanted to ask you about, which is related to the book, but also something you just said, which is you were talking about how, to a degree, we're all kind of proto-philosophers if we reflect. And maybe even if we don't reflect, we still have a hierarchy. I was reading Zena Hitt's Lost in Thought recently, and she discussed a hierarchy of values that guides our decisions within life, without which it's very hard to make decisions in the first place. And so in a sense, we all have things that we care about. And recently for me, I came to the conclusion that one of those things that's really up there in my hierarchy of values is precisely what you were describing, having a space that is a kind of asylum for free and substantive intellectual dialogue that is not restrained by sensitivity to the topic or political ramifications of, or anything else, just the pure engagement with ideas. And so for me, getting to this point where I understood what was functioning in my life, in my hierarchy of values and where I wanted to place things, actually reminded me of this sort of journey within, that I had to figure out what my journey within was. And so you mentioned both St. Augustine and Rumi in the book as giving a lot of value to the journey within. And, you know, you pulled that beautiful quote from St. Augustine about, in the Confessions, about how we travel the world, but we wonder at all these amazing things, and we walk right by ourselves and wonder at nothing. And I'm kind of at a point right now where when I think of the journey within, I think there's a stage, and this is what I want to ask you about, where you have to, I get this partially from the Bhagavad Gita, but you have to see it as a war almost at the very start. And I think that this, when you see it as a war, you simultaneously must view yourself as a general and a soldier. You come up with a strategy for how you're going to continue to live. And at the same time, you are the soldier who endures the consequences of that strategy. So you're both. You're the person who constructs the system and enacts the system and its consequences and suffers through them or benefits from them. And I'm kind of wondering, in your own journey within, if this war metaphor makes any sense, or if you think it's kind of antithetical to the process of coming up with new ideas and being happy and so forth.
Okay, there's a lot there. Let me
Sorry.
no, just give me 3 minutes to have a go at this. I love that you resonate with the idea that we're proto-philosophical at the beginning, most of us. I think I will sometimes tell students, I think we're all born philosophy majors until it's beaten out of you, you know.
Yes, I agree.
Allowing yourself to think, that is great. I love this notion of, you mentioned this notion of being lost in thought. And I think that the metaphor there is appropriate. That is, if you hang on too tightly to a set of what you believe are axioms, you can miss things. It's important to kind of detach and attach, to walk around. And
yes.
a line that I use with students is from Simon & Garfunkel, "Here's to you, Mrs. Robinson," which is, stroll around the grounds until you feel at home. So there is a kind of notion of calming down. Now, the metaphor of warfare is one that is has a long lineage, both east and west. In the Sophists, Plato describes there's a warfare between the giants and the gods. And the gods are representing the immaterial and the spiritual and the forms. The giants represent the earth and basically a materialist worldview from Plato's sites. And this notion of conflict is rich, and I do resonate deeply with the Bhagavad Gita, even though I'm a Christian. I'm definitely a student of world literature. And in fact, when I did as a young adult in England in 1972, when I made a profession of Christianity, which there's a funny story behind that, but I'll bracket that. But in any case, what did I do? I went to India. My father was an airline pilot. I could travel just on the cost of tax on the ticket. I actually got to India overland, so I traveled through Turkey, et cetera, but I could basically get back from New Delhi to LA on just $50. So anyway, I'm just a 20-year-old kid, but I've got the Bhagavad Gita, the Bible, the sayings of Confucius in my backpack. And anyway, the dialogue between Arjuna and Krishna, the charioteer, that takes place in the field of battle is one that I find very arresting. So I want to say just maybe two things. I think at different times in your life, there are different metaphors or models that's going to make a lot of sense to you for the practice of philosophy and theology. The notion of a clearing is suggests a pacific and non-violent setting. And that, I think, is born out of really the example of Socrates. Socrates was a veteran of a defeated army. So he was active in the Peloponnesian War, and Athens was roundly defeated. In fact, there was a real threat that Athens would be annihilated by the Spartans. After all, that's what the Athenians did to the million dialogues, just horrific massacre. And so when
the first realism, right?
To political realism,
yeah,
101. And when you are a veteran of a defeated army, you ask basic questions like, what is justice? How do we get into this? What form of government should we use? And so on and so forth. So I think that at times it's going to be the Pacific model, but then also I do think now culturally in the United States, perhaps Europe, Africa, Latin America, Asia, almost everywhere, we are in an age of conflict between, certainly politically, certainly culturally, certainly about matters of race and economy and so on, and tremendous conflict. And I think that the role of a philosopher today, a lover of wisdom, is not necessarily, but perhaps to be on the streets protesting, if it's a nonviolent protest, but not with rocks, and trying to get people to be in a common conversation and trying to work on everything is becoming a weapon these days, trying to, I'm going to be kind of crude. I have an uncle-in-law since died, sadly, very, very right wing. And he thinks the worst danger in the world today are terrorists and liberal professors. And we had a very funky exchange at the end of the long visit. He said, Charles, I bet you think I'm full of shit. And I said, well, if by full of shit, you mean I love you, I want to be in conversation with you, I want to share what values we have, and I want to be able to argue with you in a loving way. If that's what we mean by full of shit, yes, I think you're full of shit, and I am too. So yeah. It's trying to, I think philosophers traditionally, East and West, if you look at the Republic, Socrates tries to befriend Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus says, might makes right. You know, it's just power. And Socrates says, oh, come on, stay here a while, sit by the fire, let's talk about this. And Socrates comes up with some decent arguments about why that's not the way to go. So I think the warfare model makes sense, but it's one among others.
Yeah, and I want to just say, and then I'll let Alan ask you a question or two, because I know that he's been waiting. So I just want to say something really quick in response to what you said, which is when you talked about being defeated as the first step in the philosophical journey, in a sense, being defeated in warfare is provoking tremendous philosophical questions. Using that metaphor of the war for the world within, that definitely was true in my own life. I had to be defeated by mental health issues before I developed and constructed a life that I'm happy to live, and ask the right questions about how to live and everything else. So I was annihilated, and then the questions became more profound and the journey became a lot deeper afterwards. And the other thing I wanted to mention was you brought up this danger of holding too firmly to your axioms and so forth. And it reminded me of what Charles Sanders Peirce said when he said, just as we say that bodies are in motion and not that motion is in bodies, so too we ought to say that we are in thoughts and not that thoughts are in us. So I genuinely believe that thoughts are a kind of home we inhabit. And what distinguishes an intellectual from a person who doesn't necessarily qualify is that the philosopher, the intellectuals, got a resistance to being addicted to thoughts. To, you know, they can host a multiplicity of homes, basically. They can move without being stressed out. Whereas the person who is not that way will just find one clever idea and guard it for the rest of their life against invasion from others. And I think it's better to live a life as a thinker who searches for the truth or healing thoughts, even if they never find it, than to be a sort of anti-thinker who embraces a house made out of cardboard on a sandy beach, you know, and defends it as though it's absolute truth. So, you know, I think that what you were saying is something I've reflected on recently, and I find it very, very profound. But anyway, that is just a little addition to what you were saying. I don't know if you want to respond to that, but I'll let Alan.
I do. I'll be very brief, though. I know I love what you're saying, and Christophe, your journey has been profound, and I hope that it will bear fruit in terms of your writing and reflection, also in terms of reaching out to other people who either have been there or will be there in a similar way. So I'd say, yeah, to being defeated is knowing how to be defeated is a virtue. One of my professors at Brown, Chisholm, he was at a big American Philosophical Association meeting. A commentator just said, you know, this thesis that you have is, here's a counterexample, it doesn't work. And Chisholm just stood up and said, you're right, it didn't work, thank you. and sat down, and everybody was in awe, because you don't do that. It's usually stags in the clearing, to the death, and you hang on to that idea. But so knowing when to be defeated is good. Just a little anecdote. I used to, when I started teaching, I felt I needed to win the first argument in the classroom. And I remember vividly at St. Olaf, the first class was tough. I handed out the syllabus and somebody goes, bullshit, like, and I go, oh my gosh. And I used the word responsibility. And this guy who did the sneeze says, what is responsibility? And fortunately, I could say, well, it comes from the Latin respondere. It means answerable to or for. Does that answer your question? No, so I kind of felt like I couldn't be defeated right away. But then when my hair turned gray and I got a few books out, I felt I don't need to win even the first argument. And I think that's been important lesson for between teachers and students, is because ultimately you're going for the peership of inquiry. So I regard Christophe as a peer, and Alan, I welcome you as a peer. I'm not, the worst argument I ever had in a class was, in which I found out I was completely wrong. I said, look, I've got a PhD. And you go, oh, he has a PhD. And then I thought, oh my gosh, you are right. I'm actually wrong. And I just hit my head against the blackboard and carried on, but these guys were right. So I think, and I love what you're saying, Christophe, about dwelling in multiple spaces and having the facility to be able to travel between worlds. That's really important. So to give Alan a chance to jump in here.
Yeah, thanks. So both of you obviously said a lot of really profound things and interesting things that I resonate with. And I do have a question I want to ask you, but before getting to that, I guess where I want to start in terms of like just picking up on this flow of conversation is going back to this proto-philosopher idea, which I really like, because I have this really vivid memory of being 4 or 5 years old, and I don't have a lot of vivid memories from that time in my life, but I remember being in this auditorium, preschool, kindergarten, whatever it was, and I don't know what the purpose of being in the auditorium was, or like who was speaking, because I just had this like wild inner journey, which obviously I didn't have like the language to articulate all this at the time, but I very vividly remember just like in my head asking myself over and over again, like, who is Alan? Who is Alan? Or like maybe even what is Alan? Like the just like reckoning with this concept that like other people see me the way I see them, right? That I exist in this world as like a separate entity that other people view as like just another feature of their world, right? And like it's just very weird that my consciousness happens to be encased in like this one particular body, as opposed to like me having been born Christophe or having been born Dr. Taliaferro or something like that, right? And just like feeling the weight of that responsibility of like I'm basically like piloting this very complex piece of machinery without a manual. And I think my entire life, from an intellectual and spiritual standpoint, has been like trying to write that manual. And I, to allude to something you said, Dr. Taliaferro, earlier, you definitely do go through phases of your life that are defined by different sort of value sets, or which are in turn determined by like people that you meet or authors that you read. And that's certainly been true for me. But I do feel like it's been one long journey since that moment of like, in terms of like the battle within, like it's almost like you gotta pick apart the car to figure out how it works, because there is no manual, right? So like there is an inner journey involved. Yeah, there's an inner journey involved, and then there's the outer component as well. And I've always been like a very naturally curious person. And so for me, initially, I was interested in the sciences because I wanted to learn about the world. And then it wasn't until I was 17, 18, going through my own mental health struggle that Christophe and I have had a lot of conversations about, where I kind of like was forced to turn inward again. Like because I had been disconnected from like that original initiation into the philosopher mind when I was, so young. And where am I going with that? Well, I guess one thing I'd like to say is, I just want to acknowledge, like, having seen from the outside, at least, some of what Christophe has struggled with over the last few years in terms of his sort of inner battle. It's something we've talked about a lot because we share some similarities in that. And I remember when Christophe was still at Harvard, partly because he was my friend and partly because what I saw in him was sort of similar to some stuff I experienced. It was really meaningful to me to be able to, first of all, be his friend, and also just, sort of do what I could to provide him with encouragement of like what I knew would be a brighter future ahead. And I remember him thanking me at the time and saying, like, I owe you one, or whatever. And what I told him was, don't worry about me. Like I'm good for now. Like we all have our struggles, but I made it through like the big thing that you're going through now. Like, don't worry about me, just pass it on.
I remember that.
Yeah. And like, I'm super proud of you, not only for, persevering with what you're going through, but I have seen, I've borne witness to you doing exactly that, and like providing meaning in other people's lives. And I know that that's probably even before we met, but that's always been like a big part of your mission personally.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would describe that also as like, helping others write their instruction manual. And I also think it's sort of analogous to maybe what it's like being a professor, where, you went on your own intellectual journey and now you're sort of the caretaker of, that knowledge, but also the, recalling like what it was, what it was like for you when you were a student, and how to like transmit, your own experiences and knowledge to others. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, go for it.
If I can turn that into a bit of a question, actually, that because I
Perfect.
love that and I'm very grateful. And I said this right at the top, that one of the things I appreciate about Alan is that he embodies the things he studies. And one of the things in terms of compassion and love and generosity, and one of the things that struck me while reading Taliaferro's book, Religion's a Quick Immersion, is that you talked about this life principle concept, where you just have to respect life as such. And I found that to be incredibly powerful to me because it's a great starting point, and it's essentially the primary motivation for my own existence, in the sense that I believe philosophy can fundamentally be therapeutic. I've been reading existential psychotherapy by Yalom recently, and I do see it as a specific kind of philosophy that might be soothing or have therapeutic results for the person who receives care. But more than that, I think the search for truth itself is therapeutic. And I think it coheres with this life principle. If you start with a very simple principle that you respect life as such, and then you blend it with ways to reduce suffering that include using philosophy as a therapeutic tool, just getting people to articulate their own thoughts, then I think you could construct a very interesting kind of dynamic. And the way that I want to finally phrase this, because, compassion and love are very similar, is when you talked about the Trinity, you mentioned that some Christians believe that the Trinity enables God to possess the ideal kind of Trinity of love as well: self-love, love of another, and love of a third object that is neither you or the other that you love. And if I'm not mistaken in that. That comes from the Cambridge Platonists, right? That classification. And I'll tell you this real quick, Taliaferro. I read that by you a long time ago while I was reading some of your work about the Cambridge Platonists and the 3 conditions of love. And I use it at weddings now to great success.
Okay. Wow. I'd like to respond, and then we'll see where it goes. So I'm going to go
and
back.
This is Uncorked, so feel no pressure.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Alan and then move towards Christophe's reflections. Thank you so much for being open and sharing that experience as a young boy, just amazing. And I think if you want to follow up on this philosophy and childhood, there was a whole movement that was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s called Philosophy for Children. It was Gareth Matthews was very big on this. And you can find in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for Children. And this is philosophy you can bring to children, but it's also children doing philosophy.
Oh, yes.
It's some fabulous material. And I think that this question that you started with, who is Alan? What is Alan? This is very Socratic, to know thyself, the Oracle of Delphi is so foundational. And it seems like the experience you had is like the experience of very extraordinary people like Siddhartha, who becomes Buddha. He has the encounter with a person who's ill, person who's dead, and this wakes him up. He's been in, according to, deep legends or stories of the Buddha, this is where he begins his quest for wisdom, for enlightenment, we would say philosophy, for the love of wisdom. Now on to the struggle within. I'm reminded that in Islam, the biggest jihad is the struggle within. It's
I did read that.
And I think I mentioned in the book that if you're struggling with your writing, it's sometimes called the jihad of the pen. You're involved in a jihad with struggling. But moving very quickly now, I think this theme of friendship, and I can tie this in with Christophe's last point. Friendship is the most important thing, I believe, in life. Just very disclosively, I married my best friend. And I think that is real. Next time you're officiating at a wedding, it might sort of bring that up. But I'm not making a distinction between romance or friendship or romantic friendship. I'm not trying to nuance that. But I just think that the notion of 2 people loving each other, and it naturally leads to something more. That is, it's not like if I love, I used to always do this with Legolas, fictional character from Lord of the Rings. If I love Legolas, Legolas loves me. What do we do? It's like, love you more, love you. It has to spill over. And this doesn't have to be, what do they call it now, heterosexualism. It doesn't have to be mating, having a child. That is somewhat echoed in the Symposium of Plato, which contains the lovers between 2 males. But I would say that example that comes to mind is Wordsworth and Coleridge. They, as young men, they had self-love, proper self-love, not vanity, but they also loved each other. And what happened? You got the Romantic movement. You have the spilling over just of extraordinary poetry. And so it's not enough just to love each other. I mean, you make love, you do all these things, but even there, pillow talk is eventually going to have to be about something greater. You have to write a poem about it. So I would say one more point, and then moving to Christophe's. In my life, I was assisted not just by reading Durant's Story of Philosophy, but by an older mentor. He was widowed. He actually sponsored myself and about 5 or 6 other young men, completely platonic and above board and so on. But actually, he supported my travel for a year, and also came to visit me when I was in college and so on. And he was kind of like my Gandalf or Merlin or Dumbledore, kind of the. In this case, it could have been not gender specific. It could be what I'm trying to remember, Minerva from the Harry Potter books, could have been a female figure. But that kind of friendship led me very much towards this appreciation of the goodness of being or of life itself. So finally, the garage door opens and I'm finally getting ready to park at Christophe's last point, which is that, and that's something I discovered in the context of friendship. Nahamas at Princeton, he actually defines friendship. It's not a complete definition, but part of friendship is being together with the person whom you love, but you don't have to be, whatever it is you're doing, just even being together is itself a good. It's naturally going to lead to productivity, to creativity, to poetry, et cetera, but simply being was good. And so this man, Peter Meyering, I set up a fund in his honor, his name, at the Divinity School, at the discretion of the dean, to give to students who are in trouble, financially or mentally. And
Wow.
so maybe you guys could cash in still.
Yeah.
It was $3,000 a year that he would give in the name of this guy who helped me through a very difficult passage. My difficult passage was hallucinogenics and LSD, mescaline, psilocybin. When I was 16, 17, I got into it heavily. I started college, dropped out of college, went to England. That was where I actually, as a young adult, became a professing Christian. But it was really through Peter Meyering and just being present with him and feeling that life and being at base has a kind of wondrous quality to it. And so, and that I think is not Christian specific, it's culturally specific. There's a pervasive testimony to that in African traditional religions, in so many contexts. Simply being, Taoists are really big into this, is a...
Actually, when I was going through a quite significant manic episode in Indonesia, of all places. So I was in the island of Lombok, a very spiritual place in Indonesia. It's kind of a tourist destination for Muslims to worship there. And it's a beautiful place. And I contacted Alan in the middle of this episode saying, like, almost what you were saying now about being and the delight of life and simply existing and all these things. But in my mind, I was speaking as a relatively big authority in the universe at that point in time, in my own conception of who I was and where I was. And I won't say whether or not Alan was experimenting with any hallucinogenics, but he was right there with me. And he understood everything I was saying. And it was one of the best conversations of my life.
I was also, by the way, in love at the time.
He was, yeah.
But yeah, I do remember that moment, staring up at the stars, and even before you had called me, just feeling that profound sense of like rightness of things just kind of being in place, and reflecting on a lot of my friends who were, in similar situations of things just kind of like falling into place for them. And so it was perfect timing to get that call from you, and
yeah,
very good moment in my life.
And it leads me to wonder about a certain question that was popular we have a Facebook group at Philosophy and Theology Uncorked. And some Sinaloa professors are members, by the way. Yeah, I'll give you a list of names. It's public information since it's a Facebook group. But Gordon Marino and Laurel Carrington are in the group. And one of the questions that emerged as a relatively entertaining one, I submit random questions and see how popular they become, was whether or not ethics should be based on love or rationality. And the question underneath that is whether there is a significant difference between love and rationality as well. And I'm curious, given that we've kind of circled around the way that love shapes us and forms us, do you think that it should also form our ethical universe?
Yes, absolutely. On this point, I'm with Brentano. He was an early phenomenologist, 19th century, and he said that really right and wrong can be defined in terms of proper or improper, natural or perverted forms of love. You might well include hatred here, like hating injustice, loving justice, and so on. And I really, Aristotle would be on board on this, that basically ethics does involve shaping, that is ethical formation, shaping one's emotional life. And while some of the romantics, and actually this is in Plato too, do sometimes pit love or desire in opposition to reason. You see this especially in the Greek tragedies, where just before Medea kills her children in revenge for the infidelity of her husband, she turns to the audience and says something like, well, I'll fudge the quote a bit, like, when reason sleeps, then there are dreams of monsters. That is a quote from somebody else, but that's basically the same idea. And while the notion that love is in opposition, love or desire is in opposition to reason, on reflection, most philosophers today in the last 30 years believe that that's not a proper bifurcation. That is, it's hard to imagine reason without, I don't know, loving truth or loving logic or loving arguing and so on. And also love often can be articulated in terms of reasons, and there are one of the principal motivations of why you do things is out of love. And I think just the only thing I might just say to muddy the waters a tiny bit is that when we tend to speak about love, it tends to not be in the same arena as discursive reasoning. And this might come to the fore if you ask yourself, would it ever make sense to argue with someone that they should love you? Tell me why? Well, I'll give you 5 reasons. And I'm sure, you know, a stand-up comic has done wonders with this, and probably there are various cases where this occurs, but it seems unnatural. It seems as though the kind of what we in English anyway would refer to as loving relationships, they tend to be voluntary to some extent, but also involuntary. Like, you know, I love you. And now there are different forms of love. There's beneficent love, which is to love the good of the beloved, and then unitive love, which is desire to be united with the beloved. So one of the reasons not to tell somebody you love them, even though you do, is because it's not good for either you or them. And this is where beneficence in the Platonic tradition, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, whatever, which understands the true, the good, and the beautiful as 3 sisters who do not part without tears, because you got to get them all 3 together if possible. The unity of the virtues, and that's why I have perhaps a silly argument, but you can't love somebody too much. If you highlight the good of self-love, the good of beneficent love of self, and so on, so that what I would do in cases where somebody said, Othello loved Desdemona too much. Well, you don't actually suffocate somebody you love. That was not too much love. That was too little love. That was envy, jealousy, manipulation from Iago, whatever. The abusive relationship, is that loving the other person too much? I would say no, because it's tarnished. Probably the one who's remaining in the relationship doesn't love themselves, him, her, themselves, as much as is proper. So I think, so love, I think, is part of the very nature of education, especially moral or ethical formation. I'm using those words. They're basically synonyms today. They didn't used to be, but in terms of our formation about values, love has to enter into that.
This is, I don't know if Alan, you want to say something before I do, but I do have a response to this. Do you want to say something, Alan?
Go for it.
Okay. So this is fascinating on a few fronts, but one of the things which I really liked is you said maybe you can't give discursive arguments for why somebody should love you. Yet I think a lot of spiritual language and even arguments for ethics are arguments for why somebody should love you, included in the list of people who deserve to be loved. And so when you construct an argument for why somebody should be loving, you are in fact constructing an argument for why somebody should love you, in my opinion. So you should love me because I exist. Maybe my soul is eternal, maybe it's not. Maybe I'm loved by a divine being who grounds a reason for you to love me. And in that general direction, I had recently come up with a very peculiar theory that I'd love to hear your response to. And it's just, if our love is insufficient in the way that Kant kind of points out as well, that human love might be insufficient as a basis for morality or ethics, maybe the love of God certainly wouldn't necessarily be insufficient, since it applies to all beings. And so it could be the case that we love God, so we love a being who loves all beings, and we see ourselves as a servant of this loving being, which is in a sense to be an instrument of love in the world. And if that's the case, we have to use reasoning and rationality to adjudicate between difficult decisions about how best to love somebody, given that we don't have the natural ability to love perfectly. So reasoning has to actually be the mechanism by which we determine what to do, but love is the motivation. It could be love of your fellow human beings, though you might fall short, but it could also be love of God, and being a servant of God is actually to love your fellow human beings. So you have a sort of connection between love and rationality where you can't do it without rationality, you can't do it without love. And really, how can you be loving to somebody if you're irrationally behaving towards them, if you're really treating them in a way that doesn't make any sense? I think that to a degree, when we say this was a very loving person, we are talking about an emotion, but we're also talking about a set of behaviors which can be determined by reflection in terms of what is the best action or course of action to take in this situation. And so I'm kind of curious whether you think that it's possible to say, I ground my ethics in love to the degree that I do want people to love me, and I want to love people. And so I'm going to give them discursive arguments for why they should love me and everybody else. But I'm also going to use reasoning as the instrument by which I determine how to love. And it essentially becomes equivalent. My reasoning is my love.
Okay, I'm going to respond. I think we're on a brilliant wavelength here. I think it's correct. That certain frameworks or views, worldviews, will invite precisely what Christophe is saying. So Freud famously, is an atheist, is a materialist, and even though he did much to undermine his materialism in the course of his work, he believed that not everybody is worthy of love. Why would anybody think that you should love other people, like that this should be a precept? But in the framework of the Abrahamic faith, theistic Hinduism, if you're following the compassionate Buddha, if you're a Sikh, even Shintos and so on, you have a different worldview of reciprocation, and the world is animated by compassion. And so what I would just pause here for a second is that it's going to look differently for theists than non-theists, but some non-theistic frameworks, like the Dalai Lama's, Alan and I were talking about him earlier, he believes that, compassion and love is the preeminent actually path to happiness. He actually gives you an argument that you should love other people, because otherwise you're not going to be very happy, which is very interesting, because compassion, which means feeling with, actually does involve the expansion of sorrow in the world. When I'm compassionate over something that's illness has befallen you, sorrow has grown, but so has love and care. And then that's really key. So I would just amplify it that Spinoza, who believed in Deus sive natura, that is the world, he treated it as God, but also as nature, not just this planet, but the cosmos. For him, love was really big. In fact, his Tractatus praised Jesus so much about his love and the model of his love that some Jews at the time thought he had become a Protestant, a radical Protestant, a weird Jewish radical Protestant. But nonetheless, his framework is rich and complicated, non-theistic framework, because there's no creator distinct from the world. It does invite a kind of reasoned framework that extols, or perhaps even I'll go back on my own claim, perhaps even argues for why you should love Christophe and Ellen and the rest of us.
And on that note, it's something that you said which really, really intrigues me is, and I'm curious what you have to say about this, is whether or not when you talk about compassion, for instance, increasing suffering increasing suffering to the degree that because you feel compassion for somebody, you might suffer with them a little bit, or you feel a sorrow at their pain. And I'm curious and I know this is sort of a psychological question, but I don't believe in the great distinction between philosophy and almost any other field. I think every question can be reinterpreted philosophically to a degree. And the question I have is, do you think it's necessary to actually suffer in order to be compassionate? Because for me, in my life, in light of what Alan told me to pass it forward when I got better, and I've been better for a long time now, for years, I have been thoroughly enjoying life, and I adopt into my network of people a lot of folks who have drug disorders or mental health disorders or things which are very difficult to go through. And I feel almost no pain for them, but I do feel like I love them. And I feel like if I let myself suffer, just given the width of my network, I would be unable to love them competently, to be there for them. So I wonder if it's not true that actually to increase compassion, though we must have awareness of what people are going through, we don't have to go through it with them.
That's interesting. Controversial, because compassion and sympathy is just the Greek and the Latin for meaning feeling with.
Right.
And so if a good friend of mine,
so definitionally, I'm way off.
Yeah. Well, I mean, feeling with, though, in some sense, like it's like there's a temporal distinction, like that you can understand how they're feeling because you felt similar to how they did in the past, perhaps. So you're sort of feeling with them, but across time, to rationalize it for you.
I love that. I love what you're saying. Perhaps an illustration of that was when my father died. I was at St. Olaf, and a professor was in an office next to me and said, "Well, now you know what it's like." And that was kind of an odd thing to say.
Yeah.
But I'd say he was on to something, because I obviously knew what it's like for a child to lose a parent. It's for the parent to have died. Okay, you're not an orphan if you're an adult. I would not call myself an orphan unless I was a child. But I did come to know something. And because the world changed. And actually in a habit of this after my mother died, he goes, now you know what that's like. I said, well, you're right. And so maybe that gets to Alan's point, is that at least now when I'm trying to, as we're comfort or perhaps even grieve with somebody who's lost a parent, I'm not going to go up to them and say, I know what it's like, or, now that's not cool. But I would be able to draw on that experience.
And
I think that's so right, that sometimes if you're trying, I mean, this is kind of almost pastoral care, but professors have to do this. You will have students come into your office and share with you all kinds of things. I've had from a brain tumor to whether it's coming out or BFGF, boyfriend, girlfriend breakup, whatever, any number of things. And it will fall to you to make a decision, to use reason about whether you allow yourself to grieve, to overtly express sorrow, or just simply to be there or to listen to it. And just say, well, look, take an extension on that essay.
Yeah, and I know that, because my mother passed away while I was studying under you, actually. And I remember how incredible you were as a guiding figure during that very difficult period of time in my life. And I disclosed all kinds of, personal stories and stuff, and you were always very strong. And so it's very interesting that, I think maybe there is a balance that can be struck between feeling for somebody, whether it's across time or in the moment, and not feeling too much so that you don't crumble under the weight of your own suffering in light of the suffering of others. And so since we've broached this topic of suffering and compassion, I have one more question, which I don't think will be that hard for you, but it's something I was very curious about. When I was reading your discussion about the problem of evil and how it's handled, you mentioned that we might not, or no, sorry, not about the problem of evil. Yes, about the problem of evil. And then it goes into the Abrahamic perspective. And you say, well, we might not be able to be confident enough in our ability to know whether or not there is a God and this kind of thing, or whether or not an all good God would permit this kind of suffering. And I wonder whether or not such humility makes sense in light of one of Hegel's arguments, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which was a critique of this kind of Kantian activity of trying to analyze our own cognitive capacities and how far we can go with them. Because in the very process of doubting your cognitive capacities, you are affirming them, because you are using your cognitive capacities to doubt them. So it ends up becoming recursive. You just go ad infinitum. You doubt your cognitive capacities, and you doubt again, and you doubt again, and there would be no end. So at a certain point, we do seem to have to say, well, actually, I'm confident in my cognitive capacities, and I'm inescapably confident in my cognitive capacities. And I'm curious where you stand in relation to this idea of being confident in the capacity of human reason, whether it's fortified by theism or without theism, what you think about sort of critiquing this notion that we should be cognitively really, really humble when it's almost theoretically impossible to actually be humble cognitively in my interpretation of Hegel. What do you think of that?
Okay. All right. Stepping back for 1 second to this notion of of sorrowing with people and finding the balance is this is of a perennial significance philosophically, East and West. A good person to look at is named Sorabji, Sorabgi, Sorabji. Richard or Robert, he wrote on the emotions in antiquity, both pre-Christian and Christian and Jewish, and it's fabulous. And what you'll find yourself doing is you encounter people like Plotinus, whom I have a great deal of respect for and affinity for as a Platonist. But he wanted you to be so rock solid so that even if you saw a chariot ran over an older woman, that you would still have ataraxia. You would still be detached. It wouldn't ruin your day, as it were. That's, by the way, an anecdote. That's not from an authentic, absolutely certain text. But you find people there. Now, in terms of knowing what's truly good, what's truly evil, is this cosmos worthy of being created or not? This is on a massive scale, and we are through evolution, culture, religion, philosophical traditions, we have a great deal of methods to use to understand the various predicaments we find ourselves in. But when we think about the cosmos itself, we're thinking more about the ethics of a creator rather than the ethics of a bystander or just a human or a non-human animal or an extraterrestrial or whatever. And on this front, it strikes me that the vantage point of thinking about could theism be true is Hegel right? He was, in a way, he was a practicing Lutheran, but he was also not exactly a theist.
Right. I didn't mean to say Hegel was anti-theist or anything, but
well, there are what they call them right-wing and left-wing Hegelians. So there are different ways to read him there. But I think 2 points. One is on your last thesis, I think you're right, is that you have to have foundational self-trust in your faculties if you're going to be able to do any thinking of any kind. That is, even if you're trusting somebody else, a shaman or psychiatrist, it's going to have to be you using your reasoning to the effect that I should trust them. So self-trust is foundational. That's kind of why I think philosophy and medicine emerged at the same time historically. That is, we trusted ourselves to both healing ourselves physically as well as mentally. And a lot of early philosophy was therapeutic. So the point you're touching is called skeptical theism. It's been fairly popular in some circles. And this is a theist who takes the position, I have a preponderance of evidence to believe that there is a creator. Maybe it's cosmological argument without a necessarily existing causally efficacious being. We have no explanation for why there's a cosmos at all. And some people don't think about that, but William James did. He said, the fact that we exist at all is amazing. Wow. And whoa. So there is something. What best explains it? So, and let's say it's coupled with an argument from religious experience. And so somebody might be in a position of saying, look, there's sufficiently good reason for me to believe or to reasonably assent to a religious worldview, but I don't know why my child has leukemia. I don't know why Allison was in a lethal car accident. I don't know why Chris died, but I hope that there is something beyond the grave, that there's something more than I can observe immediately. And this is where it does seem to me, these are the big questions, and where it's coming out is actually in the anti-natal movement today. This is the movement that we should not have children. Why? Because life is, it sounds Buddhist, is full of suffering, samsara. And by bringing another child into this world, what are the odds that this child is going to be fulfilled? And let's say they become awake and they realize the magnitude of suffering. And I say this is quite relevant today in terms of thinking about the problem of evil, because if you really believe being shouldn't exist, I wonder whether you should have children. And then and Darwin actually thought this. He thought that actually a foundational assumption for reproduction is that it is a good thing to give birth to offspring. Right. And that almost is an evolutionary reason, maybe it's inbuilt, for us to be, to some extent, optimists that at the end of the day, let's not go with Gnostics who believe that the material world is fallen and suffused with evil and wickedness. Let's say there's a lot of wickedness, but there's a lot of good, and it's worth it. So that's kind of a skeptical theist who says, I don't know why some of these things. I think free will can explain some things. I think it's good that we were embodied. It's not good that we're flammable when there's a forest fire, but can you imagine biologically having inflammable bodies, or that we were herbivores and never engaged in predator-prey stuff? Possibly, but it begins to look like a fairyland. Yeah, and so that's kind of where I am as a theist. I don't have a fully worked out theodicy that is an explanation in all respects, but I think there can be some explanatory schemes. And I believe that life is worth living. Now, there are, of course, extreme cases where the truth might be inscrutable to us. Physician-assisted suicide, can certain people be such that death would be a relief? And that's called medical ethics or religious ethics or just ethics. So maybe this conversation needn't end, but I would say being a theist or being a Buddhist or Taoist and so on, it comes with certain precepts, like loving your neighbor as yourself, living in the love of God. It comes with more refined ones about poverty and wealth and so on. But it doesn't give you automatic, obvious answers to what really seem like inscrutable ethical dilemmas that we can find ourselves in.
Right. And do you think, and then I'll let Alan go after this when you talk, I'll let Alan say a few things, but I have a very quick question. And by the way, in case it seems like I'm leading too much and so forth, Alan and I did talk about this, and when it's somebody that
he's knows, your guy, your guy. I respect that.
Yeah. So
you have a history.
It's just we're gonna do an exchange, and it's uncorked. So everything from any part of the conversation can be recalled at any point in time, and it can zigzag. It's really not about a disciplined, rigorous conversation. It's about a free-flowing and see what happens kind of dialogue. But I'm just curious, if you sort of hinted at this, do you think that not only like having children implies you believe life is worthwhile, but do you believe the conviction that life is worthwhile implies God?
Oh, okay. Well,
oh yeah, it's a quick question, right?
Well,
sorry, Al.
Thinking about the dialogues, really good dialogues don't have to be in some hyper syllogistic manner. When Plato described thinking as a dialogue within the soul, I'm sure he would allow for sidebars and all kinds of things. I think that the reason why Christophe's question is so great is it pushes us to the very, maybe the limits of our values and our thinking. I'm inclined to believe that if there's not an omnipotent, loving, creating and redeeming God, that things are pretty bad. It means that possibly the majority of the world population, people alive today, do not have ultimately meaningful, significant lives in the sense that they died in poverty in childhood, they lived for several days and died. If that's the end, let's say the absolute end, no possibility of any kind of postmortem life as reincarnation or in another dimension, then it seems to me the case for the problem of evil on theism is almost unanswerable, comes close. Now, I'm not here referring to people that live, I think my parents lived full lives till 90, both died at 95. It was time for them to go. When they reached 95, their organs were failing. They lived a full life. But think about, I don't know, Chris or a student of mine who died in a car crash last year. I am so glad she had her 21 years of life. It was fully meaningful and significant and so on. But think about people that die in childhood, or people that are dying under conditions of extreme poverty. Now, believing in an afterlife should not for a moment alleviate our obligation to correct injustices, to try to prevent premature violent death. Clearly, we can't, as it were, atrophy our compassion or reaching out or urgency. But in the course of going to the rescue of, let's say, getting your child to the hospital who has leukemia and the child dies or something, it is going to, I think it's a very natural thing, even if especially if you're agnostic. But if you think there's a chance there's a God, you're going to be naturally led to say, if you exist, please be with Chris, something like that. So I think we have a natural longing. This goes back to pre-recorded history, when we, the human beings, used to bury our dead with grave goods. And it seems actually before the Eucharist, bread and wine even. And it's hard to believe that didn't occur under the assumption that death was the beginning of another journey. And so I'd say, if there's no other journey, I might still be a theist, but I'm going to clip the wings a bit. I'll go back to the historical Plato, who believed that God did not create everything, that God is sort of the good, something like that. But if you believe, as Jews, Christians, Muslims, as the majority of the world population believes, that there is a creator, redeeming God, you believe there's a God who is more powerful than death and the suffering of this world.
Alan?
Yeah, so I mean, just thinking about that, like I somewhere between, like, I struggle to articulate my sense of spirituality or of my belief in God, and struggle to care about articulating it. Sort of because for me, it's a little bit unimportant whether God exists, or a little bit unimportant whether I believe God exists, because sort of like what you're describing, if you assume that God does exist, then life is better. I mean, I think it makes it easier to lead the kind of life that I think rationally is the way that you should live. You should care for other people. You should have an optimistic outlook on life, because otherwise, if you don't have an optimistic outlook on life, it, I think, makes it maybe a little bit less meaningful to care for other people. I think you kind of have to, like, have a somewhat optimistic look on life to love people, to love individual expressions of life. And either of you can respond to that if you want. And like, that's sort of like a really unsatisfying description of like a much lengthier thing that I could go on about. But I do want to get to the book and the question that I had about the book. which it's sort of about the book itself, or the book as a whole, which is, I have a couple degrees in religion from two different institutions, the departments of which were very, very different. One of them being more sort of comparative focused and focused on the esoteric, and the other one being, I would say, more grounded in sort of like living religion and lived religion, religious communities, that kind of thing. And so I've seen sort of different perspectives on why the study of religion is important, what the study of religion should be about, what the future of religion looks like, what the future of the study of religion looks like. And in the intro to your book, you wrote a very impassioned, explanation of why you think religion's important, why you think the study of religion's important. And it just reminded me of a book that one of my professors in college wrote, which was actually written as a textbook for his Intro to Religion course. But, I found it valuable beyond that because it was very much an attempt to sort of like envision a new way of teaching religion, along with a new philosophy of why it's important to teach religion. So I'm curious, in light of all of that, what your goals were in writing this book and how you see that connected to your goals or hopes for what the future of both religion and the study of it should be, could be, that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, well, my goal, I was approached by this press that does quick immersions. They do quick immersions to, political philosophy, to the De-Extinction Project, like Jurassic Park. It gives you, and I wanted to do something. I wrote it for my students and also for those that, I'll just keep that category. So my students range from devout Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, one Sikh, fair number of Hindus. I don't know, St. Olaf has, there's a sort of a highway between these two continents. But to be open-minded, the first two chapters about the spiritual impact of having a religious life, you lower your blood pressure, you're less likely to commit suicide, sociologically. So I tried to write something that was amusing, light, not apologetic, except for being an apologist for the study of religion. That I am an apologist for that. I would say, so, and for that, I'm the senior co-editor of a 4-volume encyclopedia of philosophy of religion, just out, Wiley Blackwell, 360 contributors from around the world, maybe even some of your professors at Rice, some from Harvard, not from Harvard Divinity School, from Princeton, Yale, etc. It's, I'll send you a link to it. It's like pluralistic, it's dynamic, it's, that's the kind of face of the study of religion that I want. It's pluralistic. Also, it's not limited to secular naturalism. So there's some religious studies departments that come close to believing that the only way to study religion is from a naturalist point of view. That is not taking seriously the fact that one of these religions might turn out to be true. I think that's at Boston University, that's pretty much, what's his name, Wyman, that's the way he proceeds. You would not survive a job interview if you were a professing Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, Muslim. No, right. And I think that's not cool. And one of the things that I'll put to you, but without being an apologist, is that there is just an amazing, tangible, I'll say even joy that can be had by being a practicing Jew, Muslim, Christian, blah, blah, blah. And where what bolstered my religious life immensely when I was at HDS was the monastery, Society of St. John the Evangelist, 980 Memorial Drive. And I'm a lifelong fellowship, committed to a half-hour meditation a day, all these other practices. And I would love it if you would go some Tuesday afternoon, at 5, they used to have a Eucharist. A lot of people from Harvard students go there. I mean, not a lot, like maybe 3 or 4, and people that work around the area. But to get a sense of, well, what's it like? And it's, I would say, there can be a joy of being a secular atheist. I agree. But there is also, when you have an expanded understanding of the universe and you understand yourself as actually connected with a tradition, something I mentioned when thinking about Christianity, anytime somebody says, "Our Father who art in heaven," you actually are, in effect, committing yourself to being a sibling to those people that go back to the first century and to the Hispanic, Afro-American, everybody that is claiming that cross generations. And that's an awesome way to connect.
And I did notice that in your being an apologist for the study of religion, I remember at the intro you cited Dan Dennett, I think, saying that the study of religion is one of the most important things we could possibly do, given how important religion is in the world and historically as well. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. And if Daniel Dennett didn't exist, he'd have to be invented. I have spent my whole professional life arguing against him on almost everything. My first book is called Consciousness in the Mind of God. It could have been entitled Why Dennett is Wrong. The reason why I love his writing so much, I find it so stimulating, so provocative. I don't like his bullying. In some ways, he's like Trump. He's like a very sophisticated philosophical Trump. He might call you names like Pocahontas or something, that kind of thing. So he's kind of crude, but I personally think he realizes that if he were to fully acknowledge the existence of consciousness and what they call qualia, that is sensory subjective experience, the first person point of view, it gets very spooky in his light. And I think he becomes very close to endorsing, if you go with consciousness, you're going to have to go with theism. Theism is wrong, therefore you can't go with consciousness. He gave a talk just before I gave a talk at Middlebury College in Vermont, and he was on campus the month before, and I was told that at the end of his talk, it says, if you really want to be free, you've got to kill God. That's what you've got to do. And so I think, I quote him favorably there when he says, studying religion is the most important thing we need to do. Partly it's because he wants to make sure none of these religions are likely to be true. Because even if they're likely to be true, to some degree, that can be life-changing. I was surprised. Dawkins cited to me, he thought there's a 1% chance, I think, that God exists. I thought to myself, 1%? That's huge.
It's extraordinary. Yeah.
That'd be enough for me to go to mass, like right now. I mean, if there's just 1% chance that this is actually right. And think about it, if you're in a crisis and in the Alps and there's only 1% chance there's a rescue squad over there, surely that's enough to yell out, is anybody there?
Yeah.
So,
and then,
yeah.
And then really quickly, in the tradition of being uncorked, I'm going to try to recall something Alan said and go back to what you said, which is, and I'm very curious to hear both your thoughts. And then after this, I'll just ask a question from the group. And my least favorite part of the conversation will happen where we'll have to all say goodbye just because I don't want to tax your time too much. So that'll be very unfortunate, but just so you know, there is an end. In case this is making you question whether or not there could be an all-good God, given the length of this conversation and so forth. But Alan said something that really was important to me when he said that he believes in a kind of optimism. And you had described life as acquiring a certain meaning for lives that don't seem to acquire meaning terrestrially or while people are here on Earth in light of the afterlife. And, that is a kind of optimism as well, that there's something to look forward to or something worthwhile or something that will generate meaning and significance within the existence of some kind of a being. And there's a much longer time frame for that meaning to be generated. But one thing that really interests me, especially in the Afro-American tradition, and in particular with a friend who studies this named Steve Nunez, is the difference between hope and optimism.
Yes.
And I'm sure you know where I'm going, but hope is whether or not you expect good results, you are going to act as though this matters and this is worthwhile, because the struggle itself it's worthwhile to pursue something and have hope in it. Whereas optimism has the expectation of kind of good results. And I'm wondering where you fall on the difference between assigning hope or optimism to a worldview that would enable you to live a meaningful life, especially in the context of so much oppression and struggle that exists, that I think everybody in this conversation is hoping to negate that oppression as much as we can, but it doesn't seem likely that any of us will succeed either within our lifetime or within the lifetime of multiple generations. So how do you wrestle with the difference between hope and optimism?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. And I think those are two domains. I think that optimism would have to come in with the antinatalists. That is, might even be irresponsible. If you really believed this cosmos is not worthy of being created by a loving God, in other words, you think it would be better this cosmos did not exist. And maybe even specifically, you kind of wish about the Earth, if an asteroid was coming towards us, wiping out all life, whoa, don't blow it up. Let's just bring it on. If you really think this is really awful, why continue? And so I think optimism versus pessimism is going to enter into the antinatalist quagmire. But I think that hope is something. There's definitely an ethics to hope. That is, one ought to hope for certain things. It strikes me. If I came into this conversation hoping it was going to be disastrous, it probably would be. And people have said this in terms of studies about diplomatic negotiations, Arab-Israeli conflict. There's been a study of when it's had any success, like Camp David, versus total disaster. It's the absence or presence of hope. And I'd say this brings up a distinction. Hope is something you do. Optimism might be kind of passive. It's just kind of what occurs to you is likely. And to connect this with my suggestion that Alan might check out a monastery or an ashram or something, is that when you participate in this, you understand the difference between celebration and entertainment. Entertainment is fundamentally passive. I'm looking forward to the Beatles movie. I'm going to find it very entertaining. But when you are in a religious rite, you are actually invited or enjoined to celebrate something. That's active. Similarly, you have a choice whether to hope for something. You have a choice whether to celebrate your friendship, which you all did, and it's recorded and communicated to others. That's significant. So I think hope and optimism has to do with passive versus active, much like celebrate versus entertain.
Amazing. I'm going to stop myself from following up on the conversation and let Alan, if you're willing, ask a question or two from the group. And then what I'll do is I'll just say goodbye, and I'll let Dr. Taliaferro have the last word, whatever he wants to say. And we'll end it there.
So the question I'll pose to you from the group, I can actually lead into it just by responding to this hope versus optimism thing. which the first thing I'll say, which is how it applies to me personally, is I take full responsibility and guilt for being passive in my spirituality. And I think what you said is very spot on, that the optimism I have is based on what I think is likely to be true, which is that I've met enough individuals in my life who, I trust to be authentic people, honest people, smart people, for whom religion is a huge part of their life. And they have total confidence in the existence of God. And I've read enough in terms of secondhand accounts of such people, and traditions that have been going on for thousands of years. Many religious traditions having common themes across them, that it makes me believe there's a lot of truth and value in it. Otherwise, these things wouldn't have existed for all of human history. So intellectually, I believe that religion's very valuable. And if I, maybe this is just more optimism, but I'd like to think that I'm hopeful that at some point I'll sort of find my place in that. So all of that is to say, I don't like to define myself religiously or spiritually at this point. Like, even with a term like agnosticism, which is sort of like a, the easiest way to go about like resisting a label, because I don't really know what I am. And I think definitely like it's still an evolving process. And to tie it to your definition of hopeful, Christophe, I think that like being in sort of an uncertain place sometimes feels like a struggle, but definitely I think is an important part of a process that feels to me like it's heading somewhere. So I just wanted to clarify my sort of own intellectual position, at least, on affirming the value of religion. And I have been in community settings, both growing up, being raised Jewish, going to synagogue often, and then later in life, whether it was because of my studies or just friends and family, like going to other religious services. I don't know, it hasn't felt especially meaningful for me. But that's not to say one day it will. Anyway, so the question that I'm going to connect that to from the group, which is a connection, or it's, so essentially there was a group member that posed the question, what's the benefit of traditional religion, like a community-oriented religion over individual spiritual pursuits? Which, for the record, I gave a fairly lengthy and impassioned defense of the importance of community religion, even if it's not something I practice myself. So that's the question for you. And, I obviously have my own thoughts on it, and I'm sure Christophe does as well. And I'm sure you're aware that it's a question a lot of people have in this day and age. And in fact, like some of the other questions we got from the group, I think are just kind of variations of that same question. Like, why do people need faith? Does religion still have a place in the world today? With all of the advancements of modern science and our knowledge of the natural world, etc. So honing in on that first statement of the question, just sort of what your thoughts are on why do we need religion as opposed to just individual seeking?
Right. Let me think about where to jump in on this one. I would say, beginning with your comments on your own
Please.
Journey or autobiography in a way, is that to some extent, many of our beliefs, not just religious and secular ones, are not ones that we actively choose. It's
Mhm.
more for me, when I made a shift from being a secular atheist to being a Christian, was I entertained all these arguments, and then I read Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and I was in a loving Christian community, a recovery group. Basically, I treated it that way because I was coming off of LSD and other psychotropic drugs, but I felt that I was in a loving presence. I felt that I was in the midst of a loving, creating, redeeming, powerful God, the fountain ad fontes, coming to the fountain. I was coming to the fountain of love. That's what it felt like to me. And that's why I personally think that the reason why religious rituals are so crazy is because when we fall in love, we usually go crazy. Like I think when I met Jill, I would just go out and under a full moon and just shout her name out. In other words, I dressed up as a knight, and I broke my sword in the course of trying to court her. But we do crazy things, and that's why, in a way, the Eucharist is crazy. Bread, wine, robes. What's going on here? But it's kind of like being in love. That's what being in love is like, and I would say just simply being open to it may be the best path for you in this life at this time. This is kind of what the Dalai Lama would say. And he says to most inquirers, he actually doesn't encourage people to convert to Buddhism. He says, well, what were you brought up as? And well, what have you thought about the resources from that? Become who you are. If you are Jewish ethnically, and it's not just an ethnicity, but it's a practice, try it out, the Dalai Lama would say. See what's going on. And by the way, a lot of conversions for young adults is through marriage. And the early church, a lot of conversions were for all kinds of reasons. One, Christians tended to survive the plague more than non-Christians. Why? Because they had a community, they were caring for each other. Doesn't mean Christianity is true, but and a lot of wealthy women, widows, became Christians in cities. Christianity started as an urban religion, and they in turn got married and converted their husbands. So sometimes romantic love can be a way into, or even having children of your own can be a way of saying, well, let's give them a choice about whether this cosmos is everything. As for science and technology, I don't think either has had a sociologically significant change or shift in the religious identity of a society. Technology is being used to ferment and foster religion. Religions, you might think, are shrinking in Northern Europe and the United States, but actually sometimes, I heard your dialogue about religion versus spirituality, but if you don't limit religion to actually attending church or temples, there's actually a huge amount of spirituality, and both in the Americas, Northern Europe, as I cite, Danish youth or Dutch youth, if they're asked, have you prayed in the last 3 weeks? Like over 80% say yes. And so I think that the world is far more open to the numinous, kind of a fancy word for meaning something that's transporting, supranatural. I don't like the word supernatural, but something higher and deeper and so on. So I think,
is it Otto, the numinous?
Rudolf Otto, coined that term, numinous mysterium tremendum et fascinans. Thank you, Rudolf Otto. And the thing is, I believe that we who do not choose religion will often find surrogates, like a political figure. Probably Trump is kind of gravitating a lot of people that are otherwise, they can't really be consistently following historic Christianity if you believe one of the commandments is thou shalt not lie. I mean, but I think he's almost worshipped by certain people. And just to make it even, Stephen, I think, liberals. I am a liberal Democrat, but I could wind up fetishizing a certain political system that I wind up kind of venerating in a way that not all majority votes are good. We have to have procedural democracy, not just whoever gets the most votes wins. If the Nazis had won the number of votes, which they didn't, would that be properly democratic? No, I don't think so. So we all need to be careful, because I think religions would not have survived as they have in the intensity that it has, with about 83% of the world population today religiously self-identified. So 8 out of 10 people that you meet, chances are they're religious, maybe not in Cambridge, who knows, but that's a huge population. If you want to understand other people, you should look at their religious backgrounds that help shape them. And who knows, one of these might be an exciting alternative.
So this is when I'll do the sign off, but right before I do, I'm going to pose a question which you can ignore or not ignore after I say my goodbye. And the question is just, the way I'm interpreting what you're saying is partially, and I'm adding to it, but I kind of hear this, is maybe worship and religiosity is a disposition humans have. And so we're going to worship something. And we ought to be quite careful about what we worship. So if we worship an all good, all powerful, omniscient being, this might generate a lot of productive behavior. This might generate a lot of productive behavior and so forth. But if we worship political figures, or if we worship ideologies that are limited and don't involve a perfect being of any kind, we might be at risk of not only behaviors which are not productive, but also sustaining for ourselves an object of worship which doesn't make us feel any better at all, because it is dependent upon this world.
Well, those are protean thoughts, and I'll make one comment, but then I think I'll
do my goodbye after.
Say goodbye. Is that, what is worship? Well, worship typically in English involves such things as adoration, delight, allegiance, committing loyalty to, perhaps even fealty, regarding some person or object or even ideal as worthy of obedience and worthy even of sacrifice. Actually, doing something self-sacrificial in the course of worship. And I think that we human beings do have a tendency to worship. And it might be worshiping oneself, it might be worshiping one's relationship. Think of John Lennon's song Imagine, because I don't believe in Jesus, I don't believe in Bob Dylan, et cetera, et cetera. But then he goes, I just believe in Yoko and me. Well, so rather than a long list of things to believe, he's just going to believe in him and Yoko. Well, that's kind of like self-love and love of another, but not love of a third. They actually did perform together, so they did produce something else. But if you make that your chief reference, let's say a reference with another frail, fallible human being, actually John and Yoko split up for a while. He went to California, infidelity. They got back together again. I'm a Beatles fan. I was there at the memorial service for John Lennon in Central Park. So I had a John and Yoko museum in my dorm room when I was in college. So I'm a fan, but I would say there's a Kurt Vonnegut book like this too, where two people try to become their own country, that we're going to ignore everybody else. There's just two of us. And that's just too frail. People, I'll let you down. So you can trust me as a friend, but I will be the best friend I can be, but that is not going to be flawless and perfect. I'm going to say the wrong things sometimes. I'm not going to be available. I'll say something narcissistic. I think that we need to be careful. I'll just end with this. I think about what and how we worship in our lives.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. And so with that being said, I would like to thank everybody who's been listening to this, and I would especially like to thank Dr. Charles Taliaferro and Alan as well for engaging in this conversation. The very idea of philosophy and theology uncorked, and I was not going to mention this at the start, but at the end, actually is derived specifically from my interpretation of my first encounter with Taliaferro, where I was like, what is this man up to? He seems kind of uncorked. And then I realized I wanted to be that way too. And I think a lot of people can enjoy this stimulated life where you think and you reflect and you analyze, but you do so with a light heart sometimes, and you do so with a willingness to humor yourself and to be funny for others and clever, but not intimidatingly clever. And I think just opening the bottle of your mind and seeing what comes out is the ultimate. Opening the bottle of your mind and seeing what comes out is the ultimate expression of freedom for me, because we just figure out who we are in the process. So thank you very much. And I'll let the last word to Dr. Taliaferro.
I'll just say thank you. And if anybody's listening to this and you want to be in dialogue, I am still a professor emeritus, though, so I've retired from the classroom, talking in Iran, actually December, giving some papers in Toronto. But I'm available if anybody wants to talk philosophy by Zoom or just have an email exchange. So I'm going to sign off. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to meet you.
And the